So it spreads across 2 full pages of newsprint, which is really striking. It says at the top, "We stand for democracy. For American democracy to work for any of us, we must ensure the right to vote for all of us. We should all feel a responsibility to defend the right to vote and to oppose any discriminatory legislation or measures that restrict or prevent any eligible voter from having an equal and fair opportunity to cast a ballot." So this was this big ad, like I said, spread across 2 full pages of print. And it ran today in the New York Times, also ran on the Washington Post. And this was not an ad taken out by a progressive voting rights group or like the NAACP. This is what the list of signatories looked like under that pro-voting rights statement. Target, Bank of America, Apple, Cisco, Berkshire Partners, American Express, Wells Fargo. Also, the chairmen and chairwomen and CEOs of those and many other big, really big corporations, some of the biggest companies in the country. So yes, the fight to get corporate America off the sidelines, to get them to push to defend democracy and voting rights as we are experiencing the biggest rollback in voting rights in more than a generation as Republican-controlled states try to clip voting rights everywhere they can. That fight to get corporate America involved in defending American democracy, this big show of force in the Times and the Post today is a big win, given the size and the heft of those corporations. But also, at the same time, it's not like corporate America is speaking with one voice on this issue. The Wall Street Journal now reporting that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the main lobbying arm for big business, the Chamber of Commerce simultaneously has decided that it will pressure U.S. senators to vote against H.R. 1, the For the People Act, the big national voting rights bill that has already passed the House and that is now pending before the Senate. It'll be interesting to see how that lobbying effort goes now that so many really big American businesses are wading into this fight and saying they support voting rights. They all say they support voting rights. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is telling U.S. senators, as the Chamber of Commerce, we want you to vote against voting rights. How's that going to resolve? Against that conflicted backdrop today, we saw President Biden's nominee to lead the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, Kristen Clarke. We saw her testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on her way toward taking that all-important job. If confirmed, Kristen Clarke will be the first African-American woman to lead the Civil Rights Division in the entire 64-year history of the Civil Rights Division. Senate Republicans spent the whole day berating Kristen Clarke over all the terrible things that they see in her record as an accomplished and uncontroversial civil rights lawyer, just as they tried to do for the hearing for Vanita Gupta, President Biden's nominee for the number 3 job at the Department of Justice, who also happens to be an accomplished progressive woman of color. Incidentally, the first vote in the full Senate on Vanita Gupta's DOJ confirmation is scheduled for tomorrow. She is expected to be confirmed in a final vote next week, even though Republicans have done their best against her. And just like Vanita Gupta, there's no reason to believe that Kristen Clarke will not be confirmed to run the Civil Rights Division, despite the grilling she got from Republican senators. If she is confirmed, that'll put the country one step closer toward having a Justice Department that leads the way in fighting to protect the right to vote in states across the country. But whether the business community is going to be a sort of faithful and utile ally in that fight does sort of seem like a jump ball at this point. Joining us now, Sherilyn Ifill. She's President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Ms. Ifill, it's a real pleasure to see you tonight. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, Rachel.
Let me ask you first about the Kristen Clarke nomination. You have been an outspoken proponent that Kristen Clarke is the right person for this job and that she should be confirmed by the Senate. Her confirmation hearing was marked by Republicans sort of doing a Fox News pageant, acting out Fox News primetime arguments against her as if she's the real racist and she's really controversial. What do you make about this process thus far and her prospects of being confirmed in the end?
Well, Rachel, I have to say I thought that Kristen Clarke was masterful today. She's not a TV lawyer; she's a real lawyer, and so she was really able to defend her record. She has an astonishing career as a civil rights lawyer behind her, leading the Civil Rights Bureau at the New York State Attorney General's office. She, of course, was a lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. leads the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under law, worked at the Department of Justice for 6 years. And so she comes to it with just tremendous experience. But today what people could see was just the intelligence, the poise, the confidence, and really she couldn't be shaken. It's unfortunate. We should be thanking ourselves, and I think Senator Cory Booker said that. We should be grateful that someone like Ms. Clark is willing to serve, particularly at this time in the country when we need someone with her kind of vision, clarity, and commitment to really lead, as you say, in the enforcement of the nation's civil rights laws and to really address the crisis of civil rights that we're in at this moment in the country.
Part of the crisis, or at least the confrontation that we're having right now in the country, is over the crucial issue of voting rights and voter suppression tactics that seem aimed quite specifically at African-American voters, other voters of color, poor voters, disabled voters, other people who can be cut off from the polls if the voter suppression legislation is written just the right way in order to accomplish that goal. What do you make right now, Sherilyn, about the sort of push me, pull you happening with corporate America, with business interests that are starting to speak out, including in this remarkable ad today in the New York Times and the Washington Post, starting to sort of find their voice as supporters of democracy and supporters of the right to vote, while simultaneously we're seeing things like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce lobby U.S. senators that they ought to vote against the most important voting rights bill that we've seen in a very long time.
You know, Rachel, I'm actually quite comfortable with this discomfort because what we are seeing is a real shakeup happening in corporate America. As I have been appearing and speaking with business leaders and business groups, I have been telling them that we are in a democracy moment. You know, there was one crisis that we could see on January 6th because it was filled with violence, because it was there on our TV screens and we could all feel the sense of America slipping away from being a stable democracy. But I want to be clear that these voter suppression laws, that the one that passed in Georgia, that are being proposed in Texas, that just passed in Arkansas, modeled on Georgia, criminalizing giving food and water to people on line voting. In South Carolina, we just submitted testimony today in opposition to the South Carolina voter suppression bill. This is as much a threat to the integrity of our democracy as January 6th was. Because it's, as the Supreme Court has said, the right to vote is preservative of all rights. It is fundamental. And this state-by-state attack, we saw an attack on the Capitol on January 6th. Now we're seeing a state-by-state attack on voting. And it's going to require all of us to stand up and to speak powerfully for democratic principles, and that includes corporate America. They don't get to be bystanders. And this is a moment of reckoning in which corporate America is going to have to tell the rest of the country whether democracy is something that they are agnostic about, right? Whether it is not necessary to the business model of American corporations, or whether they believe that as citizens, and corporations, as you know, actually receive lots of rights as citizens by the United States Supreme Court. Well, if you are a citizen, you have an obligation to stand up for our democracy. And so I think the ads today, that was incredibly powerful. I do feel the need to point out that this shift, this seismic shift, this move, this destabilization, and this willingness of hundreds of corporations to speak up was led by Black business leaders, Black business executives who first spoke out in that ad with 72 of them signing it in the New York Times several weeks ago. And they listened to the voices of grassroots and community activists and national civil rights organizations pushing back against what was happening in Georgia. This is what it's going to take if we're going to protect and save and strengthen our democracy. It's going to take people moving out of their comfort zone and being willing to stand up for the principles that should undergird any true democracy with integrity.
Sherilyn Ifill, the President and Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Sherilyn, it's always really good to see you. Thank you for joining us with so much going on right now in the news that hits your areas of expertise. It's really good to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, we've got much more ahead here tonight. Stay with us. Really escaped from. Here it is in his own words. Quote, "The car's engine roared as the gunman punched the accelerator and we crossed into the open desert. Another gunman in the passenger seat turned and stared at us as he gripped his Kalashnikov rifle. No one spoke. I glanced at the bleak landscape outside, reddish soil and black boulders as far as the eye could see. I feared we would be dead within minutes. It was November 10th. I'd been heading to a meeting with a Taliban commander, along with an Afghan journalist and our driver. The commander had invited us to interview him outside Kabul for reporting I was pursuing about Afghanistan and Pakistan. The longer I looked at the gunman in the passenger seat, the more nervous I became. His face showed little emotion. His eyes were dark, flat, lifeless. I thought of my wife and family and was overcome with shame. An interview that seemed crucial hours earlier now seemed absurd and reckless. We reached a dry riverbed and the car stopped. "They're going to kill us," Tahir, my journalist colleague, whispered. "They're going to kill us." The New York Times published that account by Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter David Rode in the fall of 2009. And it was the story of what he had been through over the course of the previous year. The previous November 2008, less than a week after the U.S. election where Barack Obama was first elected, David Rode and his two Afghan colleagues, a fellow journalist and a driver, were kidnapped outside Kabul. They were held by the Taliban for 7 months and 10 days before Rode and his journalist colleague finally figured out a way to escape and flee into the night. David Rode at that time was already a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. And once Rode escaped and got away from the Taliban, his editor back at the New York Times was interviewed back in the United States about what everybody was now learning about what had happened to David Rode. And his editor was sort of bewildered to report at the time, to tell NBC News at the time, that one of the first things David Rode did after escaping from his Taliban kidnappers and getting himself to safety after 7+ months in captivity, one of the first things he did after getting himself free was to send an email to his editor at the New York Times because he had some corrections that he wanted to see in a story the Times had just published. He had a few small corrections that he wanted to make, so he sent me an email. Imagine having the presence of mind. After being kidnapped and held hostage by the Taliban for the better part of a year, imagine having the presence of mind to get out and then immediately contact your editor and send some edits to the paper to make sure the story they've got about it is just right. But as I said, ultimately, David Rode would write the full story himself of what had happened to him in a 6-part series for the Times, explaining his kidnapping, his captivity, how they survived, the desperate escape. He and his Afghan journalist colleague used a car's tow rope that David Rode had found and then hidden in a pile of old clothes, hoping that they might be able to use it at some point in the future to escape. They used that tow rope from the car to basically fling themselves over a perimeter wall. It was about 5 feet wall on their side of it. It was a 20-foot drop on the other side. They dropped down into a sewage ditch on the other side of it. They ultimately fled into the night and presented themselves at a local militia base. In the middle of the night, he and his colleague walk up to this militia base, and the guards on duty were absolutely convinced that these two guys showing up in the middle of the night looking like hell, absolutely convinced they were foreign suicide bombers showing up in the middle of the night to kill them all. Here's how Rode describes it, quote, "I held my hands high in the air and dared not move an inch. A nervous guard could shoot us dead as we stood in the street. With my long beard, scarf, and clothes, I looked like a foreign suicide bomber, not a foreign journalist." Another voice came from inside the building. It sounded as if the guard was waking up his comrades. 1 or 2 more figures appeared on the roof and aimed more gun barrels at us. The guard on the roof intermittently spoke in Pashto with Tahir. I heard Tahir say the words for journalist and Afghan and American. Quote, "My arms began to burn. I struggled to slow my breathing. I desperately tried to not move my hands. I told Tahir, tell them we will take off our shirts, thinking the guards might fear that we were suicide bombers who wore vests packed with explosives. Tahir said something in Pashto, and the man responded. Lift up your shirt, Tahir said. I immediately obliged. The guard spoke again. He's asking if you're an American, Tahir said. I'm an American journalist, I said in English, surprised at the sound of my own voice in the open air. Please help us. Please help us. I kept talking, hoping they would recognize that I was a native English speaker. I said, we were kidnapped by the Taliban 7 months ago. We were kidnapped outside Kabul and brought here. I said, do you speak English? Hoping one of the Pakistani guards on the roof understood. Do you speak English? The guard said something to Tahir. Tahir said, they are radioing their commander. They are asking for permission to bring us inside. Tahir pleaded with the guards to protect us under the traditional honor code of Pashtunwali, which requires a Pashtun to give shelter to any stranger who asks. He begged them to take us inside the base before the Taliban came looking for us. About 2 or 3 minutes passed. The guards stood behind sandbags on the roof. Above us, stars glittered in a peaceful, crystal clear sky. For the first time that night, it occurred to me that we might actually succeed. Escape, an ending I never dreamed of, might be our salvation. He says, quote, I held my hands still and waited. For the whole time that David Rode was being held captive by the Taliban, the New York Times, his employer, kept quiet about it in the hopes that keeping it out of the press, making it not public, or keeping it from becoming public would increase the odds that David would survive. And he did survive. And his survival, his escape, is just a remarkable story of resilience and pluck and keeping your head in unimaginable circumstances, even when they drag on and on and on and on and on. But it has also stuck with me, not only because of what it says about David Rode, but because of what it showed us all in very starkly human, small terms, what it showed us all about the core impossibility at the heart of the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the core strategic impossibility. Because what we went there for, obviously, was to depose the Taliban as the ostensible leaders of Afghanistan, to get them out of power, to punish them for giving the al-Qaeda terrorist movement a haven. Al-Qaeda launched the 9/11 terrorist attacks against us, and then the U.S. invasion pushed the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan to punish them for the actions of al-Qaeda and to prevent them from harboring al-Qaeda again or any other transnational terrorist entity that could threaten the United States again in the same way in the future. And I say it that bluntly because that is spelled out explicitly in the authorization for the use of military force that Congress passed after 9/11. That has been used as the justification for the ongoing U.S. war there ever since, for the 2 decades since. But if deposing the Taliban, taking them out of power, was step 1, step 2 was never all that clear. I mean, the overall idea was to keep the Taliban from returning to power by standing up a different Afghan government that could govern the country, that could also hold the Taliban at bay, that could defend itself against the Taliban. U.S. and coalition forces stayed in that country for 2 decades trying to make that happen, fighting the Taliban directly, yes, but also trying to stand up and support an Afghan government and Afghan security forces to fight and resist the Taliban themselves. But look at this at a human level. Look back at what happened to David Rode and his 2 Afghan colleagues back in 2008 and 2009. They were kidnapped while on their way to interview a Taliban commander. That Taliban commander had been interviewed by other Western journalists in the past, but for whatever reason, he decided he would double-cross them and kidnap them instead of giving them their interview. And what David Rode was able to piece together from captivity, what he would later write about for the Times, was the fact that only for the first week that he was kidnapped, only for the first week that the Taliban was holding him and his colleagues, only for the first week were they in Afghanistan. After just 1 week, they took him and his colleagues across the Afghan border into Pakistan. And that's where they kept him. They kept him in a series of different houses and hovels in Pakistan for the better part of a year before he was able to escape. They kept he and his colleagues in a Taliban safe zone, basically, in Pakistan, where, as he observed from captivity, he could see that the militant group, the Taliban, basically did as they pleased, basically ran the place, and from which they ran all their operations in both countries, in both Pakistan and in Afghanistan. Right? So just think about that in terms of what that means for strategy, in terms of what that means about the point of what the American government and the American military is doing in Afghanistan. There's this big U.S.-led war next door against the Taliban in Afghanistan. Except that enemy that the U.S. was fighting in Afghanistan had another place they lived and worked and planned most of their work. It's like if you were trying to lose weight And so you kept dieting and dieting, cutting back on your portion sizes and your meals, being super disciplined all day long about eating well and never snacking, right? But then it turns out every night you'd sleepwalk into the kitchen and gorge on everything in the fridge, right? Doesn't necessarily matter what's happening during the day if that's what's happening at night. Same thing strategically in drastically oversimplified terms in this 20 years of war. Knocking the Taliban out of power in Afghanistan was one thing. Defeating them in some kind of larger war, preventing them from ever rising again in Afghanistan, that was something that a large U.S. military conflict in Afghanistan was never going to be able to do. Not when the Taliban wasn't confined to Afghanistan and wasn't really based there in terms of most of what they were doing. The night that then President George W. Bush announced in October 2001 that the U.S. military had started the first airstrikes in Afghanistan, the opening salvos of the war in Afghanistan, a prominent Democratic U.S. senator at the time, senator named Joe Biden, was interviewed on CNN just a few hours after President Bush made his announcement. Biden told CNN that night from Delaware that he was in favor of the airstrikes. He had, in fact, been in favor of the start of the Afghan war. He also expressed to CNN confidence that the Taliban would not be in control of Afghanistan much longer. But then he said this, he said, quote, "The easiest part is going to be taking it down. The hard part is going to be putting it together." Right. Knocking them out of power in one place turned out to be doable and quickly. Setting up something else to keep them at bay, to defeat them, to unite the nation of Afghanistan under a different kind of government. That didn't happen. Not with 100,000 U.S. troops there at a time, not with thousands of Americans losing their lives there and tens of thousands of Americans being injured there, not in a year of combat there, not in 10 years of combat in there, not in nearly 20 years of combat there. And so today, now as president, Joe Biden stood in the exact same place, in the exact same room that President Bush stood in when he announced the start of the Afghan war nearly 20 years ago. Joe Biden was there today to announce the end of that war.
We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a fifth. It's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. We went to Afghanistan because of a horrific attack that happened 20 years ago. That cannot explain why we should remain there in 2021. Rather than return to war with the Taliban, we have to focus on the challenges that are in front of us. I'm the first president in 40 years who knows what it means to have a child serving in a war zone. And throughout this process, my North Star has been remembering what it was like when my late son Bo was deployed to Iraq. How proud he was to serve his country. How insistent he was to deploy with his unit, and the impact it had on him and all of us at home. We already have service members doing their duty in Afghanistan today whose parents served in the same war. We have service members who were not yet born when our nation was attacked in 9/11. War in Afghanistan was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking. We were attacked. We went to war with clear goals. We achieved those objectives. Bin Laden is dead, and Al-Qaeda is degraded in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And it's time to end the forever war. Thank you all for listening. May God protect our troops. May God bless all those families who lost someone in this endeavor.
President Biden speaking today from the same room, same place in the same room where President George W. Bush announced the start of the Afghan war nearly 20 years ago. The president's remarks today were followed by a supportive statement from the Secretary General of NATO, who said all NATO troops will leave Afghanistan on the same time frame as the United States. That means that all U.S. troops and NATO troops will be out by September 11th of this year. The president's remarks were also followed today by the president himself going to Arlington National Cemetery to pay his respects to the 2,488 Americans killed in the war thus far. He was asked by a reporter at Arlington if the decision that he announced today was a hard call. Here's what he said.
Hard to believe, isn't it? I'm always amazed at generation after generation, the women and men who are prepared to give their lives for their country. Look at them all. I'm sorry?
Was it a hard decision to make, sir?
No, it wasn't. To me, it was absolutely clear. Absolutely clear.
Absolutely clear. He says it was absolutely clear. George W. Bush actually tried to end the U.S. war in Afghanistan after he had started it. He was not able to do so. The Obama administration, President Obama deliberated long and hard about what to do in Afghanistan. As his vice president, Joe Biden, argued, often without many allies in the administration, that it was time to finally and fully just get U.S. troops out. He did not win the argument back then, and troops did not leave under President Obama. But now today, Joe Biden is president, and he has made that decision. And it's a firm decision, and it's not conditions-based. It is a date certain by which U.S. troops will be gone. He said today, interestingly, that it was not a hard decision. He said it was absolutely clear. A war with the Taliban, he argued today, is not worth more than the 20 years and thousands of American lives we have already put into it. That Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David Rhodes spent more than 7 months being held hostage by the Taliban. In 2008 and 2009, he escaped, was able to write about his captivity. Today, hearing the president's speech, I thought about the service members and military families that I know who have served in Afghanistan and how they're feeling today. I also thought of David Rhodes. And David Rhodes, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, now executive editor at thenewyorker.com, joins us now. His most recent book is In Deep, the FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. David, it's a real honor to have you with us tonight. Thanks for making time.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm amazed by that introduction. Thank you.
Well, it's always I've always been sort of stunned by what you've been through, and how you've put yourself together again and got up and continued with what has been an astonishing career. David, I just wanted to ask you just at a personal level, given what you've been through, given these incredibly unique set of circumstances that you've been through in that ordeal, how do you feel about the president ending the war today?
I feel relief, and what really struck me and impressed me about what you took away from my story is the impossibility of winning this war because of the role of Pakistan. And as long as Pakistan continues to give the Taliban a safe haven, the place I was held for 7 months, it's an impossible war to win. I fear for my Afghan friends. We can talk more about that. They're friends right now. I'm desperately trying to get out of Kabul, but I think 20 years is enough. If Pakistan is going to continue to do this, it's time to leave.
In terms of the sort of worst case scenarios, obviously this is a controversial decision the president is announcing. I think that the fact that he's announcing it so definitively, that he's not carrying on a public process where he's weighing his options, he's just saying what he's going to do, I think will circumscribe the debate somewhat. But you are hearing a lot of criticism today, including from people who say that, the Taliban will now ascend, if not in all of Afghanistan, then in most of it, that the Afghan government has never been stood up, that there will be a human rights disaster in the country of a different kind of the human rights disaster we've seen there during the course of these 20 years of war. How do you, I want to talk specifically about Afghans who have helped Americans in Afghanistan, as you just described, setting that aside for a moment, thinking about those sort of worst case scenarios. What do you make of those prospects and whether the U.S. has options to stop them?
The prospects are terrible. The Taliban carried out a series of targeted assassinations. Last year, they killed over 100 doctors, humanitarian workers, and journalists, Afghan women rights activists. It is right to pull out U.S. troops, but it's also right to vastly increase the number of visas we're going to give to those Afghans who, fought shoulder to shoulder with American forces. My friends who are journalists, Tahir, the Afghan journalist who saved my life, he's out of Afghanistan, but all of his relatives aren't. So I have many Afghan friends who are terrified. So the right thing to do is to get them to the United States to help our allies. 150,000 Afghans have died since 2001. 40,000 of them are civilians. That's compared to 2,500 Americans. So those Afghans who fought alongside American troops, we need to help them get out while they can.
Do you have confidence that the U.S. government can do that? I know that in the aftermath of the U.S. leaving Iraq and then ultimately somewhat redeploying to Iraq with the rise of ISIS, Iraq and Afghanistan veteran service members advocated fiercely and relentlessly that Iraqis who had helped the U.S. in that conflict should get visas and should be brought home and their families should be protected and American promises to them should be upheld. Did we learn anything from any of the failures to do that in Iraq that makes you have any confidence that the U.S. government might be better on this score toward the Afghans who helped us as we try to do this now?
I don't have much confidence. There was sort of a, long-running Islamophobia in this country. We can bring Afghans here. We can vet them safely. The vast majority of them that come here are peaceful. And I would call on the Biden administration. This is a bold move by President Biden. I applaud it. He needs to show how our immigration system can work. He needs to vastly increase the number of Afghans that are allowed to come here in these very few months that exist. He needs to vet them. And I think that's his responsibility. We cannot just walk away from this. It's a dangerous situation. It could be, like you said, the Islamic State, after U.S. troops pulled out of Iraq, they took control of much of Iraq. And U.S. troops could be back in 6 months. But I do think this is the right step. But we must help get our Afghan allies out of the country.
Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter David Rohde, now executive editor at NewYorker.com. David, thank you for your time and your insight tonight. Again, your experience there is unique and something that I think everybody has learned from. Thanks for being willing to talk with us about it tonight.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
All right.